The keys were already on the table when Catherine walked into the room. 3 of them, old brass, heavy enough to make a sound when they touched the polished wood. And beside them was a thin leather folder that had apparently been sitting inside a locked cabinet for years. Nobody in the room seemed particularly interested in the keys. Everyone was watching Catherine, because she had not come there to argue with Camilla's family. She had not come to negotiate another extension. And she certainly had not come to discuss redecorating the residence. She had come because one question had finally become impossible to avoid. Who, exactly, had the right to call that house home? Now, before we go further, I want to be clear about what you're hearing. This is a dramatized royal commentary story built around public figures, public royal dynamics, and the kinds of institutional questions surrounding family arrangements and property. The private conversations, legal documents, and events we're about to examine are part of a fictionalized reconstruction. They are not being presented as verified private events. But the question underneath the story is a fascinating one. What happens when a family has spent years behaving as though something belongs to them, only for lawyers to discover that the paperwork says something completely different? Because that was the problem Catherine had walked into. And the strangest part was that Camilla's Parker family hadn't necessarily been lying. They had been told things. They had been reassured. They had been allowed to settle in. Over time, they had simply stopped asking whether the arrangement was temporary. They assumed it wasn't. And that assumption had become so deeply embedded that people had started behaving as though the house had already been handed over. Rooms had been furnished. Personal effects had accumulated. Staff knew which rooms belonged to which family member. Renovation discussions had taken place. There had even been quiet conversations about what the property might look like several years into the future. That last detail is important, because you can visit a house, you can stay in a house, you can even be treated generously inside a house. But once you start planning what the property will look like 10 years from now, you are no longer behaving like a guest. You are behaving like someone who believes the future has already been promised. And that was precisely what Catherine's lawyers wanted to understand. Who had made that promise? And, more importantly, did that person actually have the authority to make it? 3 hours before those keys appeared on the table, everything had looked completely different. The residence was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. There is a difference. The kind of quiet you find in a royal property early in the morning, when staff are already moving through corridors but nobody is yet speaking loudly enough for the house to feel awake. A few members of Camilla's extended Parker family were there. They had been there before. There was nothing unusual about their presence. That was part of the problem. Nobody reacted when they entered. Nobody treated them as temporary occupants. Nobody asked when they were leaving. And that tells you something about how assumptions become reality inside powerful families. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens one ordinary day at a time. Someone leaves a suitcase. Someone is given a key. Someone is allowed to keep a few personal things in a room. A staff member starts recognizing their preferences. A contractor is told to make a small alteration. A family member says, "We'll keep that here," and nobody corrects them. After enough years, nobody remembers when the arrangement was supposed to end. That was the atmosphere Catherine encountered. And initially, she did not object. She watched. She asked questions. She requested the paperwork. That sounds small. It wasn't. Because the first thing her legal advisors noticed was that the property's current arrangement did not appear to match the way everyone was behaving. The family believed the residence was effectively theirs to use. The paperwork suggested something much narrower. A temporary right, a conditional arrangement, an accommodation that depended upon circumstances that were no longer clearly in place. And once that distinction appeared, Catherine wanted everything examined. Not just the current agreement, everything. Previous agreements, letters, amendments, maintenance records, renovation requests, accounts, correspondence, even documents that appeared to have nothing to do with the current dispute. Because lawyers understand something families often forget. The truth of a property arrangement is rarely found in the sentence everyone remembers. It is usually hidden in the sentence nobody reads. And so the search began. At first, there was nothing dramatic. That is how these things usually work. A solicitor found an old reference to the residence. Then another. Then an amendment. Then a reference to an earlier arrangement that had apparently been superseded. Nothing seemed decisive, until someone found a phrase that did not fit. It was buried in an older property schedule. The wording was dry, almost painfully dry, but it referred to the residence not as a private family home, but as a protected holding subject to conditions. The lawyer reading it stopped, then read it again. And this is where the story changes. Because the problem was not that the Parker family had no permission to be there. They appeared to have permission. The problem was that the permission may never have been transferable in the way everyone had assumed. In other words, someone could allow them to stay, but that did not necessarily mean someone could give them the right to remain indefinitely. That distinction sounds technical. It is not. It was the entire dispute. And suddenly, every conversation about the property looked different. Every promise sounded different. Every renovation began to raise a new question. Why were people spending money preparing rooms for a family whose long-term right to occupy them had never been formally established? Why had nobody noticed? Or perhaps the better question was, who had noticed and decided not to say anything? That was the question Catherine's team could not ignore. So they went further back, much further. And this is where the old paperwork became interesting. The residence had a history that predated the current family arrangement. Long before the current occupants, long before the current generation, there had been an earlier settlement governing how the property could be used. The original purpose was not particularly mysterious. It was designed to keep the residents protected from informal transfers. The people who created it understood that royal families change, marriages change, relationships change, people make promises, and promises made inside families have a habit of becoming dangerous when money and property are involved. So the original arrangement had safeguards. The residence could be occupied. It could be maintained. It could be used. But permanent beneficial control required conditions. Those conditions mattered, and one of them appeared to have survived every later amendment. Nobody had removed it. Nobody had replaced it. Nobody had formally canceled it. It had simply disappeared beneath layers of newer paperwork. And now Catherine's lawyers had found it. Hold that detail. Because this is where the story becomes much more than a disagreement involving Camilla's family. The document was old, but it was still relevant. And beside the relevant clause was something even more interesting. An acknowledgement. Someone had signed that the conditions were understood. That was the moment the lawyers stopped treating this as a possible misunderstanding. Because if nobody knew about the restriction, the story was one thing. But if someone had acknowledged it years earlier, the story became something else entirely. Someone knew. The question was who? The answer was buried several pages later. And when the lawyer finally found the signature, the room reportedly became very quiet. Not because the name was shocking on its own, but because of the date. The signature had been made years before the Parker family began treating the residence as their long-term home. That changed the timeline. Suddenly, the legal issue had not appeared when Catherine intervened. It had existed before the family moved in. It had existed while everyone was making plans. It had existed while the property was being adapted. And if the signature was genuine within the fictionalized reconstruction, then someone had known that the arrangement had limits. That is when Catherine reportedly asked the question that mattered most. If they were never given permanent rights, why were they allowed to believe they had them? Nobody had an easy answer. Because there are two ways a powerful family can create an expectation. One is through paperwork. The other is through behavior. And behavior can sometimes be more persuasive than a document. If someone gives you a key, lets you furnish a room, tells staff to accommodate you, and speaks about the property as though you will be there for years, eventually you stop thinking like a guest. You start thinking like a resident. That may have been exactly what happened. Camilla's family had not necessarily demanded ownership. They had simply accepted the environment that had been created around them. And over time, that environment became a kind of informal promise. But Catherine's lawyers were looking at something colder. They were looking at what could actually be enforced. And the more they looked, the more uncomfortable the answer became. There was no simple transfer, no clean deed, no clear permanent grant, no document saying the Parker family could occupy the property indefinitely. Instead, there were layers of permissions, informal assurances, temporary arrangements, references to future possibilities, and beneath all of it, an older restriction that had never disappeared. The house was not theirs, at least not in the way they had begun to believe. But Catherine did not immediately remove anyone. That is important. She could have turned the discovery into a confrontation. She did not. Instead, she asked the lawyers to establish the exact position. Because if you are going to tell a family that their understanding of their home is wrong, you had better be certain. So they checked again and again. They compared the old agreement with the later documents. They examined whether any amendment had overridden the original restriction. They found nothing. Then they checked whether an informal arrangement could have created a permanent right through subsequent conduct. Again, nothing appeared sufficient. Then they looked at the financial records. And this is where another piece of the puzzle appeared. Money had been spent on the residence, quite a lot of it. Some of the spending was ordinary maintenance. Nothing unusual there. But other expenses were different. Furniture, room alterations, storage, private facilities, changes that made sense if the occupants were expected to remain for a considerable period. The problem was not the amount. It was the assumption behind the spending. Someone had been preparing the house for a future that the paperwork did not clearly permit. And that raised another question. Who had authorized it? Because if the property was protected by a settlement, spending money to create what looked like a permanent family residence could become more than a family decision. It could become an institutional problem. Catherine understood that. And this is where her approach becomes important. She did not say, "Remove them because I don't like this." She asked, "Who authorized this arrangement?" There is a world of difference between those two sentences. The first is personal. The second is institutional. And once the question became institutional, everyone had to answer it, including Charles. That was when the matter could no longer remain a quiet disagreement between relatives, because Charles had reportedly been involved in the broader understanding surrounding the residence. Again, in this dramatized reconstruction, that does not mean he necessarily intended to break any rule. He may have believed he was simply making his extended family feel secure. He may have believed the arrangement could later be formalized. He may have assumed that because the property was under royal control, he had greater authority over it than the documents actually allowed. That is the tragedy of these situations. People confuse control with ownership. They confuse permission with entitlement. And they confuse a promise with a legal right. Charles may have been doing exactly that. But Catherine's lawyers needed to know whether his involvement had changed anything. The answer was devastatingly simple. No. The old restriction remained. And then came the moment that made the entire situation personal. Catherine asked to see the original acknowledgement. The lawyer placed it on the table. She looked at the date, then the signature, then the clause, and reportedly asked only one question. Was this ever formally replaced? The lawyer's answer was no. Not according to the documents being examined in this fictionalized scenario. That was it. No shouting. No accusation. Just one answer. No. And once that answer existed, the Parker family's position became almost impossible to defend. They might have been invited. They might have been reassured. They might have been welcomed. But welcome is not ownership. And the house was not the kind of property where years of informal occupation automatically transformed into a permanent family right. The next step was inevitable. The family would have to leave. But even then, Catherine did not make it theatrical. She wanted the process handled quietly. The rooms would be cleared. Personal belongings would be collected. Staff would return the property to its previous arrangement. Any unnecessary humiliation would be avoided, because the goal was not to punish the Parker family. The goal was to restore the property to the arrangement that the documents actually supported. And that distinction matters, because if Catherine had treated this as a personal feud with Camilla, the story would have been easy. It would have been jealousy, power, family rivalry. But that was not the story being constructed. The story was about an institution discovering that an informal family arrangement had slowly drifted beyond its legal foundation. And then something happened that nobody expected. The lawyers found another document. This one was not about occupancy, it was about succession. And this was the discovery that changed everything. The original agreement had not merely restricted permanent occupation. It appeared to contain a broader principle. The residence was intended to remain protected from being absorbed into another family line through marriage or informal arrangement. That meant the issue was bigger than Camilla's relatives staying in the house. The underlying structure had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of gradual transfer that had now taken place socially. First, people were allowed to stay. Then they were treated as residents. Then they were given rooms. Then renovations were discussed. Then the idea of a long-term future emerged. And eventually, everyone behaved as though the property had quietly changed families without anyone ever signing the document that made it happen. Except the document never changed. That was the shock. The house had changed socially. The paperwork had not changed at all. And that is why the lawyers became so interested in the old clause. It was almost as if the past had been waiting for someone to notice. The more Catherine's team examined the file, the more they discovered that previous generations had anticipated this exact problem. Not this exact family, not this exact dispute, but the pattern: a marriage, a new family, private assurances, pressure to accommodate relatives, and eventually the possibility that a property intended to remain within a protected structure could drift toward people who were never part of that structure. The safeguards were there because someone had understood human nature. People make promises. People fall in love. People want their new families to feel included. And when a powerful person says, "This will always be your home," the person hearing it rarely asks for a lawyer to explain what always means. That is the difference between emotional language and legal language. Emotion says always. Law asks until when. Emotion says ours. Law asks whose. Emotion says family. Law asks under what instrument. And Catherine's lawyers were asking all three questions. Meanwhile, the Parker family still believed there might be a way to stay. They pointed to the years they had spent there. They pointed to the money invested. They pointed to the understanding that had been created. They pointed to the fact that they had not secretly taken the property. They had been openly welcomed. And emotionally, that argument was powerful. But legally, it was weak, because if the original settlement required a formal transfer, no amount of furniture could create one. If the property required trustee approval, no private assurance could replace it. If the agreement restricted permanent occupation, years of informal use did not automatically erase the restriction. The family was discovering something painful. They had confused the way they were treated with the rights they possessed. And those are not always the same thing. When Catherine finally met with Charles in this dramatized version of events, she did not arrive with a stack of accusations. She arrived with the folder. That was all. The folder was placed on the table. Charles looked at it, then at Catherine, then back at the folder. And there was a moment when neither spoke. This is the kind of moment that tells you more than a speech ever could. Because Charles knew what old legal folders meant. He knew that once a matter reached that stage, it was no longer about someone's feelings. It was about what could be proved. Catherine reportedly asked him whether he knew the original restriction was still active. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked when the document had been created. The lawyer gave the date. Charles looked down. And that was the emotional center of the meeting. Not anger. Recognition. because the date took him back to a period of his life when the people involved were different, the circumstances were different, and the residents had a completely different meaning. The old world had left a rule behind, and now that rule was affecting the new world. Charles may have believed the arrangement surrounding Camilla's family was an expression of inclusion, but the documents did not recognize inclusion. They recognized conditions. And that was the moment the king's personal intention collided with institutional reality. Catherine did not have to tell him that. The lawyer did. The arrangement can continue only within the limits of the original authorization. A sentence like that sounds almost harmless, but everyone understood what it meant. The Parker family's long-term occupancy could not continue. There would be a transition. The rooms would be returned. The keys would be surrendered, and the residence would revert to its protected purpose. Charles was reportedly quiet. Again, this is fictionalized. But the silence is important because it captures the emotional logic of the story. What do you say when you discover that a promise you made with good intentions was never yours to guarantee? Do you defend the promise? Do you defend the paperwork? Or do you admit that the two were never compatible? That was the dilemma. And Camilla's position made it even more painful, because this was not simply about distant relatives being moved from one property to another. It meant acknowledging that the family had been allowed to believe something that could not be sustained. For years, the residence had represented security. Now it represented uncertainty. And perhaps that is why the keys mattered so much. They were not just pieces of metal. They represented an assumption. Someone had handed them over. Someone else had accepted them, and now Catherine was asking for them back. But just as the meeting seemed to reach its conclusion, the senior solicitor turned another page. And this is where the lawyers found something genuinely unexpected. The document did not simply restrict permanent occupation. It contained a review mechanism, a clause requiring that any substantial change in the property's use be documented and approved. And according to the fictionalized file, that approval had never been completed. Not once. Which meant the renovations were not just informal. The long-term family arrangement was not just informal. Even the plans for future use had been operating without the formal approval that the old agreement required. Suddenly, all those little details mattered. The furniture, the room changes, the storage, the private facilities. The conversations about long-term occupancy. None of them independently proved wrongdoing, but together, they revealed something. The property had been gradually transformed around an assumption that had never been formally established. That was the shocking discovery. Not that somebody had stolen a house. Not that someone had secretly forged a document. Something much quieter. The entire family arrangement had been built on an assumption. And the assumption had survived because nobody had challenged it, until Catherine did. Think about that. The most important thing in the story was not something someone had done. It was something nobody had checked. Nobody had opened the old folder. Nobody had compared the original agreement with the current arrangement. Nobody had asked whether the words written decades earlier still applied. Everyone simply carried on. And that is how institutional mistakes become family traditions. One person assumes. The next person inherits the assumption. The next generation treats it as fact. And eventually someone asks for proof. That is when the entire structure can collapse. The Parker family began removing their belongings, and the details were strangely ordinary. A painting came off a wall. Books were packed into boxes. A desk that had sat in one room for years was moved. Photographs disappeared from a corridor. A wardrobe was emptied. A room that had once felt lived in became anonymous again. There was no dramatic eviction scene. No shouting in a courtyard. No cameras waiting outside. Just people carrying boxes through familiar corridors. And perhaps that was more powerful. Because a home does not stop feeling like a home when a lawyer says so. It stops feeling like a home slowly. One empty shelf at a time. One photograph removed. One key returned. One room locked. And then the brass plate on one of the doors was unscrewed. That small object said more than anyone could have said aloud. For years, it had suggested permanence. Now it was gone. But the lawyers were not finished, because they had noticed something else. The maintenance records. The residence had been treated financially as a protected property. Certain costs were paid through one structure, other costs through another, and the distinction mattered. If the property was protected under the old arrangement, then some of the expenses associated with preparing it for long-term private family use may not have been appropriate. Again, this does not mean criminal wrongdoing. It means the spending had to be reviewed. Who approved it? Who benefited? What was the stated purpose? And why did some of the invoices describe changes that looked much more permanent than the official use of the property suggested? That was when Catherine's lawyers found the final piece. An internal description of the future use of the residence, not guest accommodation, not temporary family residence, something closer to long-term family occupation. That phrase was enough to make the lawyers stop, because the words on the financial paperwork did not match the legal status of the property. The social arrangement had moved ahead of the legal arrangement. And once that happens, someone eventually has to stop the process. Catherine became that person. This is also where William's position becomes interesting, because William did not need to oppose Camilla personally. He only needed to understand what happened if institutional rules were ignored. If a protected property could gradually be converted into a private family residence simply because someone powerful wanted it that way, then the protection meant nothing. The same problem could happen elsewhere. Another residence, another family, another informal promise, another generation. That is why the matter could not simply be dismissed as a family disagreement. It had implications for how royal property arrangements were handled. The house became an example, and Catherine understood that. Her decision to remove the Parker family was therefore not framed as punishment. It was framed as correction. Return the property to its documented status. End the informal arrangement. Remove the private modifications. Restore the rooms. Return the keys. Close the loophole. And perhaps most importantly, prevent the same misunderstanding from happening again. That last part was what the lawyers cared about. They recommended that future family accommodations be documented much more clearly. No vague promises, no assumptions, no, you can always use this place. If the arrangement was temporary, say temporary. If it was conditional, say conditional. If it ended at a certain point, write the date. Because the lawyers had discovered what happens when powerful people rely on memory. Memory changes. Documents don't. And the most painful part for Charles may have been realizing that his own good intentions had helped create the misunderstanding. He had wanted family unity. He had wanted Camilla's relatives to feel included. He may have wanted the residence to become a symbol of stability. Instead, it had become a legal problem. Not because anyone necessarily intended it to, but because intentions cannot replace authority. That is the sentence I keep coming back to. Intentions cannot replace authority. You can sincerely promise something. You can sincerely believe you can give it. You can sincerely want the person receiving it to feel secure, and still not have the legal power to make the promise real. That is what made the story so painful. Camilla's family had been given something emotionally, but not necessarily legally. And Catherine had been forced to choose between preserving the emotional arrangement and preserving the institutional one. She chose the latter, quietly, firmly, without spectacle. And that is why the headline, "Catherine forced Camilla's Parker family from their home," only tells half the story, because it makes Catherine sound like the person who took something away. The lawyer's discovery suggests a different interpretation. She may have been the person who finally asked whether the thing being treated as a home had ever legally become one. Those are two very different stories. One is about power, the other is about evidence. And in the end, evidence won. There is another detail worth considering. The original document had been created long before the current dispute. The people who wrote it could not have known exactly what the future would look like. They could not have known which marriages would happen. They could not have known which relatives would become important. They could not have known which family would eventually occupy the residence, but they understood one thing. Royal families change. Institutions survive. And if you want a property to remain protected, you cannot rely on goodwill alone. You need rules. That is what they created. And decades later, Catherine's lawyers discovered those rules were still sitting there, waiting. The strange thing about old paperwork is that it does not care who has forgotten it. It does not care how many years have passed. It does not care how comfortable people have become. A clause written 30 years ago can still change a decision made yesterday. That is the power of a document. And perhaps that is why Catherine's approach was so effective. She did not have to overpower anyone. She did not have to publicly embarrass Camilla. She did not have to challenge Charles's authority in front of cameras. She simply asked the lawyers to read the old words. And then she let those words speak. The Parker family left. The residence was restored. The modifications were reviewed. The keys changed hands. And for a while, it looked as though the story had ended. But there was one question still hanging in the air. Why had the original restrictions survived for so long without anyone challenging the arrangement? Was it simply an oversight? Was everyone genuinely unaware? Or had people known about the restriction and assumed that nobody would ever enforce it? That question is impossible to answer with certainty inside a fictionalized story. But it is exactly the kind of question that makes royal property disputes so fascinating. Because institutions often survive through assumptions. People assume someone else has checked. Someone assumes the agreement was updated. Someone assumes the king has authority. Someone assumes the lawyers dealt with it years ago. And then one person asks for the original document. Everything changes. That may be the most important lesson in this entire story. The document did not suddenly become powerful when Catherine opened it. It had always been powerful. It had simply been ignored. And the final image is almost too simple. The 3 keys that had once represented comfort were no longer hanging inside the residence. They were returned. The rooms were quiet again. The Parker family's belongings were gone, and the old leather folder was closed. But the clause remained, exactly where it had been decades earlier, waiting for someone to read it. And perhaps that is what makes the story so uncomfortable for everyone involved. Because if the lawyers were right in this dramatized reconstruction, Catherine did not actually take the Parker family's home. She took away the assumption that they would always have it. Those are not the same thing. She did not erase years of memories. She did not pretend they had never been welcomed. She did not deny that promises had been made. She simply established that a promise is not the same as a title, and that being treated like family is not necessarily the same as having a permanent legal right. For Camilla's family, that distinction came too late. For Charles, it may have been even more painful, because the house had represented something emotional, a gesture, a promise, a way of saying, "You belong here." But the lawyers discovered something colder. Belonging is not always something a person can grant. Sometimes the institution decides. Sometimes the old document decides. And sometimes the people who made the rules decades earlier have the final word without ever being in the room. That is what happened here. The past walked into the room through a leather folder. It sat beside 3 brass keys, and it changed the future. So now the question I want to leave you with is this. Did Catherine really force Camilla's Parker family out of their home? Or did she simply become the first person willing to ask the question everyone else had avoided for years? Who actually owned the future of that house? Was it the people who had been living there? Was it the person who had promised them security? Or was it the old agreement, sitting quietly in an archive, waiting for somebody to finally read the sentence that everyone had forgotten? Because if the lawyer's discovery changed anything, it was not simply the family's address. It changed the meaning of the past. Every key suddenly looked different. Every promise sounded different. Every renovation carried a question. And every year the Parker family had spent believing they were secure became evidence of something else entirely. They had not necessarily been given the house. They had been given the belief that the house would one day be theirs. And there is a world of difference between those two things. Perhaps that is why Catherine never needed to raise her voice. She had something much stronger, the paperwork. And if you want to be here when another forgotten royal document turns an ordinary family story into something much bigger, stay with us, because with this family, the most important part of the story is often the page nobody thought to turn over.